vibe going on. You just gonna set it up. I just waiting for those horns. Should be coming soon, right? What you feeling down for? No, I like that. I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. Open your eyes. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up. Listen, Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Look around and then I see a little old man and a homeless lady. They don't have no food to eat. Father, give them a warm place to sleep. Come on, wake up the people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Good afternoon, Brother Jegna here with another Afrocentricity book show. I hope you guys have all had a great week. Weekend is here. Make the last of it. Most of us are back to work tomorrow. I must remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass R Us. You can find Glass R Us on 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH. That's Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. That is 0208 800 6663. Please go to Glass R Us for any of your glazing needs, whether it's double glazing, putty glazing, repairs, shelves, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, any of your glazing needs. Please go to Glass R Us. If you mention this show, you'll get a 10% discount, which is not bad at all. So Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH, 0208 800 6663. That is 0208 800 6663. You can go to them for all of your glazing needs. Mention the show and you'll get a 10% discount. Okay, so we're starting with a new book this Sunday. So no doubt we'll go on a few Sundays I should say. The book I'm going to read today is Survival Strategies for Africans in America. But he says in the book, this is for Africans in the diaspora generally and Africans universally. So this is really like a part two. If you're familiar with Browder File, Survival Strategies is by Anthony Browder, who's written a number of books. But Browder File was one of the earliest ones I ever read, one of the earliest books I read. And it had a big impact on me because so much information in there. Yeah, culture, history, health, spirituality, religion, you name it. It's all in that book, okay? So the book I'll be reading this Sunday and for a few weeks is Survival Strategies by Tony Browder. Subtitle is 13 Steps to Freedom. 13 Steps to Freedom. Okay, so I'll be reading the preface. Let me just say the book is divided into 3 parts, okay? So part 1 is about the mind. Part 2 is about the body. And part 3 is about the spirit. So I'll be reading the preface, introduction, and then we'll move straight into part 1, which is about the mind. Okay, so Afrocentricity Book Show. Please tell your family and friends all about it. Every Sunday, 4 till 6 p.m. Every Sunday, 4 till 6. So, this is the preface of Survival Strategies. Many people are capable of looking back on their lives and identifying events that profoundly affect the way that they saw themselves and their place in the world. I experienced such an event in the winter of 1980 during my first study tour in Egypt. Throughout my trip, I became increasingly aware that I had been miseducated throughout my years of formal schooling. During my tour in Egypt, I saw numerous examples of a glorious ancient African legacy that had been distorted and falsely attributed to persons of a lighter hue, of foreign origins. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to see the world through African eyes. I was thrilled and overwhelmed by the possibilities this new outlook presented. On my return to the United States, I was consumed by an intense desire to share my experiences with my family, friends, and anyone who was willing to listen. During the following years, my desire to share my experience with a broader audience became a reality when I was offered an opportunity to conduct a 7-week lecture series on ancient Egyptian history at the University of Maryland. The series was well received, and later that year, I was offered it several at locations in the District of Columbia. The public response to the lectures exceeded my expectations and prompted me to rededicate my life to documenting the positive portrayal of the worldview of the African experience. I sought information that validated the glory of ancient Africa and confirmed the presence of a spiritual force that still influences Africans throughout the world. My research has centered on the areas of African ancient Egyptian history, culture, philosophy, symbolism, architecture, and spirituality, and their combined influence on the Western civilization. I have been in the information business since 1982, when I founded the Institute of Karmic Guidance as a vehicle to disseminate my research. The significance of my work was impressed on me at another evening gathering during Black History Month in 1990, when I was invited to give a keynote address at a government agency in Washington, D.C. On my arrival at the facility, I was informed by the sponsors of the program that they were a division of the CIA. As I was introduced to the audience by the director of the facility, I was shocked to hear him declare that I was in the same business as their organization, except that I gathered information relative to the survival of black people. That was a flattering comparison, but it also caused me to reevaluate the scope of my work and its impact on the lives of people who have been mentally and spiritually robbed throughout miseducation. I recently came to understand the significant role agencies that gather intelligence, data, play on analyzing and disseminating information. The quality of information gathered is crucial to the success of any intelligence operation. Accurate details must be collected, analyzed and distributed to individuals with the need to know, who will then implement the appropriate strategies to ensure the continual empowerment of the organization group, or nation. Intelligence gathering is a painstaking and serious occupation that involves many sacrifices and risks. However, the benefits gained from the analysis and application of this data are well worth the challenge. It would mean the difference between annihilation, marginal survival, or living a life of limitless potential for current and future generations. I was intrigued by the idea and possibilities of using intelligence and information to liberate the minds of African people. Prior to this speaking engagement, I considered myself just another Black History Month presenter. However, I have since developed a greater appreciation for my work and a deeper commitment to share my research with the African Americans community. This intelligence, when properly analyzed and implemented, can empower and ensure survival in a society that is growing increasingly complex and hostile. I have also come to understand that the hostility we exhibit towards each other stems from years of miseducation and unresolved personal conflicts, because our limited access to and appreciation of African history and culture, we currently function on the varying levels of awareness and personal development. We Africans have been socially engineered to reject our past, and far too many of us live in a state of suspended animation. We deny the historical realities confronting us daily. Excuse me. Too many mistakenly believe that the past has no bearing on our present and is unrelated to the future. Thus, we have been conditioned to live our lives disconnected from cultural values, principles, and ideals essential for peaceful living. This publication is designed for persons who earnestly desire knowledge that will lead to a change in consciousness. It is hoped that the contents of this publication will be embraced in the true spirit of Harambee and Sankofa. This book proposes to teach Africans in America and worldwide how to pull together collectively and reclaim our past in order to build a meaningful future for ourselves and our descendants. Survival Strategies for Africans in America was written specifically to help recovering Negroes and former Black people become born-again Africans. It is meant to inform, not to offend. It consists of useful information that, when dutifully applied, will allow us to break free of the invisible bonds of oppression designed to stymie our mental, physical, and spiritual development, and to prevent us from becoming self-determining people. Self-determination is a natural byproduct of self-awareness, and together they form the mental and spiritual cornerstones of freedom. Survival Strategies for Africans comprises of 13 steps that leads us from self-awareness to self-determination. Steps 1 through 5 relate to the African mind. Steps 6 to 9 reference the African body. And steps 10 to 13 discuss aspects of the African soul. The methodology allows for the complete integration of the 13 steps so that the newly developed consciousness will lead to freedom. By following these steps, we will ultimately enter into the realm of self-empowerment and personal well-being. The material in this publication has been carefully researched and is now presented to the African family for review and consideration. It is hoped that these survival strategies will inspire us to continually seek truth in all our endeavors and to achieve and sustain the freedom that is long overdue. So that is the preface of Survival Strategies. Now this is the introduction. In 1987, I began writing a bi-weekly newspaper column from which I selected 22 articles for a collection of essays that was published in 1989 as From the Browder File, 22 essays in African American experience. So The Browder File is a book that we all really need to have on our bookshelves. It's an excellent book, and it's one of the first books I really read which kind of enlightened me to the world and what was happening in the world. In the time that has passed since those articles were written, my faith has been tested, my understanding has been deepened, and my commitment to the African spirit within me is stronger now than ever before. Enthusiastic responses from thousands of people who have read From the Browder File prompted me to write the second volume of essays. I have often been told the liberating effect of the Browder File has had on the lives of those who have read it, and I am frequently asked by readers, what should I do now? How do I use this information? Survival Strategies for Africans in America, 13 Steps of Freedom, was written in a direct response to those questions. I have broadened the scope of much of the material presented in the first volume of essays and provided additional insights that will lead to the stated goal, freedom. This book, however, was not written exclusively for African Americans. With minor modifications, these steps may be used by Africans living in any corner of the world. I have found that no matter where on the globe African people live, we are all subjected to the same oppressive forces of racism and white supremacy. Fortunately, we also have access to the same liberating spirit of the Creator. The 13 Steps to Freedom contains 3 categories that relate to the liberation of the African mind, body and spirit. Each step is an individual lesson that should be studied and applied before proceeding to the next step. Each step is divided into 3 components to help facilitate your understanding. The first component represents the voice of inspiration, which frequently speaks to us and silently plants liberating seeds, ideals in our minds. When these ideals are properly nourished, they spring forth from our consciousness as vibrant thoughts that move into action. This component is presented in the italized type and proceeds through 6 to 9, which is covered in one component. The second component is the thoughtful realization of inspired ideals. This provides an in-depth analysis of the issue and evaluates its personal and cultural significance. The third component offers a practical approach for incorporating the pertinent aspects of the thoughtful realization into your daily life. This segment is a prescription for mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, and is preceded in the ancient African symbol. And it's got the symbol of the Uchat eye, which is also called the Eye of Horus. When all 13 steps are mastered and linked, they form a practical and symbolic stairway to freedom. On the practical level, freedom is defined as the exemption of or a liberation from the control of some persons or arbitrary power. Symbolically, freedom also means the free, unrestricted use of the dome, the head, or the mind. Freedom of the mind is our primary objective, because once it is achieved, it makes other goals readily identifiable and therefore easily attainable. The mind is the conduit through which a person can access spiritual consciousness. If the mind is constrained and filled with thoughts of negativity and inferiority, it is incapable of tuning in spiritually empowered thoughts. A self-constrained mind is programmed to engage in self-destructive behavior that is often injurious to the body. To paraphrase a frequently used statement in the African American community, if you free your mind, your behind will follow. For thousands of years, it has been known that the mind is a conduit that attracts ideas and emerges from the universal elements that duplicate and enhance the thought process. To that extent, you are what you think, and your potential, your future development has already been determined by those who have programmed your mind. For those of you who are ready, now is the time to wrest control of your mind from those who will keep you mentally and spiritually enslaved. Now is the time to take the first of many steps that will allow you to grow beyond the constraints that have been kept you functioning on survival mode. Freedom can be achieved if you are willing to take conscious and deliberate steps in a direction. If you are ready, let the journey begin. So that is the end of the introduction. So now I'm going to read part one. Part one is called The Mind. And there's a little preface here on the step one. It says, the United States of America was conceived in sin. Liberty and justice are Uncle Sam's adopted parents, and their names were duly recorded on his birth certificate of the 4th of July, 1776. The identity of this nation's true parents has been a well-guarded secret over the 2 centuries. The mere mention of their names evokes a chorus of denials from the offspring, the echoes of which can be heard reverberating from sea to shining sea. Despite numerous detractions, America's family records have been carefully searched. Blood tests have been conducted, and the genetic evidence has been carefully analysed, which confirms beyond a shadow of doubt that racism and white supremacy are the true parents of the nation. Knowledge of America's true parentage is in grave importance, particularly if America's stepchildren, Africans in America, wish to live a truly meaningful lives. The European Americans The European Americans' Declaration of Independence were a hollow mockery of rife with contradictions to the enslaved Africans and to the indigenous population of the land. What kind of mind would create a nation where all men were deemed equal in the eyes of God, except the red man and the black man? If you study the development of early Europeans, you'll begin to see how they have historically viewed the world and its inhabitants. By examining the history of racism and white supremacy, you will also gain a deeper understanding of numerous challenges that confront you in America, and may I add, and the world. So step one. So this is the first category in the book, which is split into 3 categories, and part 1 is about the mind. So this is step one. The heading is Racism and White Supremacy are the most persistent problems confronting Africans in America. Racism and white supremacy were the motivating ideologies behind the British colonists' drive to exterminate Native Americans and to consume and assume control of the land. Racism and white supremacy were also responsible for creating and sustaining conditions which led to the enslavement, death, and disenfranchisement of millions of Africans and their American descendants. Throughout the last 4.5 centuries, racism and white supremacy have continually threatened the existence of African people before, during, and after their enslavement. These threats have forced Africans to modify their beliefs, thoughts, and behavior to survive on a planet where they are regarded as third world people. Those who now claim to be members of the first world are actually latecomers to the human family. Africans were the first human beings on earth. They gave the world its earliest culture, civilization, and conceptualization of God. Mankind continues to benefit from the Africa's interpretation of the universal forces that affect every living thing. Africans in America will never know truths, or these truths, as long as they continue to view the world through the eyes of their former slave masters. In order for Africans to understand the nature of the world in which they live, they must first understand the nature of the people who interpreted the world for them. This interpretation determined their perceptions of reality and dictated how they now function in the world. Since the world of the contemporary African has been shaped by racist ideologies formulated long ago, it is necessary to understand the roots of racism and white supremacy in order to correctly interpret current events and formulate meaningful plans for the future. Contrary to popular belief, there is no such thing as race. Race is a false construct which was created by Europeans hundreds of years ago in order to differentiate themselves from people of African descent and other people of colour throughout the world. The concept of race was created by scientists and scholars at Göttingen University in Germany between 1775 and 1800. During this 25-year period, these scholars invented the word Caucasian, divided humanity into races, and contended that the white race was superior. I hope everybody are taking notes about this, okay? So let me just read this bit again. Please bear with me, yeah? And it's very important that you think you have pen to take notes. Contrary to popular belief, there is no such thing as race. Race is a false construct which was created by Europeans hundreds of years ago in order to differentiate themselves from other people of African descent and other people of colour throughout the world. The concept of race was created by scientists and scholars at the Göttingen University in Germany between 1775 and 1800. During this 25-year period, these scholars invented the word Caucasian, divided humanity into races, and contended that the white race was superior. The illusionary myth of race has been in existence for only 2 centuries, but it pales in comparison to the ideology of white supremacy and the system of racism that it spawned. The power inherent in the concept of white supremacy, along with The mere utterance of those words create within the minds semantic and visual perceptions of black inferiority. If one believes that one white is superior, then anything that is non-white, coloured or black is perceived as inferior. If white is holy and pure, then black must be ungodly and evil. As crazy as it seems, this convoluted logic has been used by civilized, so-called civilized men, in speech marks, scholars, scientists, theologians, politicians and others, for hundreds of years to justify the murder and enslavement of people of colour. If Africans are to survive in America and the world, they must confront the inescapable realities of racism and white supremacy. They must be aware that their ancestors have battled these oppressive forces or these oppressive foes for over 15 generations, and that freedom will not be achieved by prayers and dreams alone. The liberation of the African mind, body and spirit can only be achieved through the use of an African-centered value system that makes the study of the successes and failures of the past the highest priority. Many ethnic groups have struggled to survive in America, and those who have achieved a meaningful measure of freedom have wisely maintained their ancestral roots. Clearly, the road to the future begins in the past. The prevailing belief among paleontologists, geneticists and anthropologists is that humanity began in Africa over 200,000 years ago. Scientific evidence suggests that the first humans left their birthland after thousands of years and populated the rest of the world. By virtue of their birthplace, the first humans responsible for populating the planet were not Negroes, they were Africans. What the evidence shows is that the first people who inhabited the lands that we now call Europe looked nothing like the people who live there today. As one would imagine, there are varying opinions of how Africans became Europeans. In order to understand how this transition occurred, we must rely on scientists from a variety of disciplines to reconstruct the ancient beginnings from a variety of disciplines, the beginnings of mankind. With the advent of recent breakthroughs in genetic testing, the new archaeological discoveries, we are beginning to get a clearer picture of the past events that shaped the current reality. We now know that the Earth has undergone upheavals that profoundly influenced the development of humanity. It is generally believed that the last ice age, which occurred between 75,000 and 12,000 years ago, created environmental conditions that led to the transformation of dark-skinned people into light-skinned people. There are many texts that discusses these events, but Dr. Charles Finch, a physician and researcher, has provided an in-depth analysis of race and human origins in his book, The Echoes of the Old Darkland. Finch provides a concise discussion of various theories, complex issues pertaining to human development. He offers the following conclusion, and this is the words of Dr. Charles Finch. He says, for 7 million years, the hominid line leading to modern human man emerged, evolved, and attained his final form in East Africa. Modern man, Homo sapiens sapien, evolved entirely in Africa about 200,000 years ago. The emergence of ethnic variation of the original African type took place around 50 to 30,000 years ago. Modern man came to occupy Asia at least 75,000 years ago. Modern man came to occupy Western Asia, which we call Europe today, between 50 and 40,000 years ago. The earliest European Caucasian, in speech marks, evolved from the African between 30 to 25,000 years ago in the Ice Age environment near the southern limit of the Great Line of the European glaciers along the 51st parallel of southwestern Russia. When the aforementioned data was compiled and analyzed sequentially, they present a convincing story of the conditions which led to the evolution of the modern European. Nearly 75,000 years ago, the northern cradle of Western Asia, which is now called Europe, was covered by glaciers about 1 mile thick on average. These glaciers extended from the Arctic Circle across southern England, northern Europe, Germany, Poland, and across southern Russia, forming a barrier that prevented people from entering or leaving the affected areas. For some 60,000 years, these icy conditions existed, and the human beings trapped behind this wall of ice were forced to adapt to their new surroundings or perish. Those who survived did so by hunting wild animals for food, draping their bodies with the fur of their prey, and finding warmth and shelter in underground caves. The harsh weather conditions of Western Asia subjected the cave dwellers to numerous hardships. It also played a role in their transforming their physical appearance. The diminished amount of sunlight in the northern hemisphere, coupled with frequently overcast skies, caused the skin of the cave dwellers to gradually become lighter. If I digress a minute, because in this glacier ice, also called the worm, W-U-R-M, ice age, not only was the ground like a mile thick of ice, but the clouds were ice as well. Very little sunlight got through. So I continue. Scientists now understand that this was the cause of genetic mutation, which occurred because of a shrinking gene pool and the adaptability of the human body to new environmental conditions. In the extreme north of Western Asia, Europe, black skin became an adaptive liability for two reasons. Number one, it was more susceptible to frostbite, and number two, it limited the absorption of adequate amounts of vitamin D, which is essential for healthy bone formation. Medical studies of soldiers who fought in Korea and both world wars show that African American troops were 5 times more likely to develop frostbite than Europeans or European American counterparts. Such data led physicians to conclude that white skin is more cold resistant than black skin. Finch, citing research from the Journal of Psychology, or Physiology I should say, states that there is also a 3 to 5 times greater penetrance of ultraviolet light in white skin compared to that of black skin. Medical research has shown that Africans living in the northern latitudes have a susceptibility to rickets that is 2 to 3% higher than that of Europeans. Rickets is a disease of the skeleton system that causes the bones to weaken and is often the result of vitamin D deficiency. Rickets is also caused by an absence of sunlight. Excuse me. Under ideal conditions, the melanin in the skin of African filters out the harmful ultraviolet rays of sunlight that causes skin cancer, but allows enough ultraviolet light for the skin to produce vitamin D. In a colder environment where there is less sunlight, melanated skin is always a liability. Thus, in order for black-skinned humans to survive during the Ice Age of Northern Europe, they had to mutate and develop white skin. It is generally accepted, or it is a generally accepted view, that the transformation from black skin to white skin people occurred over a period of 10 to 20,000 years. What is now coming to light is that this transformation not only affected the colour of skin and eyes, the texture and colour of the hair, but also produced changes within the brain that influence human consciousness. Scientists and researchers now know that the absence of sunlight alters the function of the pineal gland and inhibits the ability to produce sufficient amounts of two essential hormones, melatonin and serotonin. The pineal gland is a small organ in the middle of the brain. Throughout the early 20th century, medical schools have taught their students that it was the vestigial sensory organ that served no known purpose. This belief was based upon the study of Europeans whose pineal gland was found to be calcified in 85% of the population. When pineal research was broadened to include peoples of African ancestry, it was discovered that they had a pineal calcification rate of only 15%. Within the last 25 years, the medical community has revised its opinion of the pineal gland. While its function is not fully understood, it is regarded by many as the master gland in the body because the hormones it secretes are essential for normal human development. It is interesting to note that during the 1980s, public discussions on melanin and melatonin and the pineal gland were often limited to a handful of African American scholars who held annual melanin conferences. Their research was often regarded as pseudoscientific and ignored mainstream European scientists for over a decade. However, by 1995, there was an explosion of interest in melatonin, and dozens of European scientists began touting it as the wonder drug of the ages. Throughout 1995, various publications and television and radio programs informed the public of melatonin's ability to retard the aging process, regulate sleeping patterns, improve sex performance, and improve health, vitality, and longevity. Because of the media's attention, the public's interest in melatonin and the functions of the pineal gland increased substantially. While medical science has yet to fully understand the various functionings of the melatonin in the body, it has acknowledged that insufficient amounts of melatonin causes the body and mind to degenerate at an accelerated rate and thus inhibits performance. I have been aware of the significance of melatonin over 15 years. It is interesting to note that melatonin became a household word only after it had been synthesized, commercialized, and marketed for mass consumption by those who are unable to produce it naturally. Issues pertaining to melatonin, and hormones that the pineal gland will be discussed greater detail in step 9. So I just remind you that this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. We are reading today The Survival Strategies by by Anthony Browder. And I'm on the category 1. The book is split into 3 parts, so I'm reading the first part, which is about the mind. So I hope you're enjoying this. So there are numerous African American scholars whose research on melanin has come to my attention over the years. So Richard King, MD, is one of the leading melanin researchers in the African American scientific community. and he frequently refers to melatonin as the civilizing hormone. Dr. King is a psychiatrist and author. His research has led him to conclude that insufficient amounts of melatonin in the body often result in abnormally aggressive patterns of behavior. Her Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, MD, she's an ancestor now. She passed away, I believe, last year. May she rest in peace and in power. Is another prominent African-American psychiatrist and researcher. She's best known for her study, the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy, which revolutionized people's perception of race and racism. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing theorized that the current system of racism is a manifestation of Europeans' fear of genetic annihilation. This fear grew out of the Europeans' realization that genetically they are a recessive minority in a world that is predominantly inhabited by melanated people. This fear led to the development of a collective genetic inferiority complex that later manifested in the establishment of a global system of white supremacy. Thus, the diminished presence of melanin and melatonin in the Europeans, coupled with the realization that they were a minority in a world predominantly inhabited by people of color, were critical factors in the development of the false belief of superiority of white-skinned people. This belief escalated considerably after 1492 and has served as a catalyst for the development of the current system of European global domination. During the 15th and 16th centuries, as European explorers travelled throughout the world, they discovered, in speech marks, lands inhabited by people of colour, humans with black, brown, red and yellow skin. Whenever they had intercourse with women of colour, their offspring was always coloured. Thus the fear of being alone in a world of colour, coupled with the inability to produce their own kind from interracial mating, established a deep-seated fears within the European mind. The only way that they could rule was by implementing a global program of deception, destruction and domination. That's the powerful 3 Ds there. Deception, destruction and domination. The nature of the society which we have inherited was forged into a crucible of fear and ignorance. It was established centuries ago and perpetuated worldwide. Dr. Kwame Nantambu, Associate Professor of Afrocentric Geopolitics at Kent State University, has written numerous publications that examine the relationship between racism, white supremacy, economics and global politics. In his latest book, Egypt and Afrocentric Geopolitics, Dr. Nantambu provides an historical analysis of how Europeans achieved global domination. And he says, in 1492, remember 1492 is when Columbus set sail, yeah? I think the poem goes, which they teach each other, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that blue soon turned red when they travelled everywhere. But this is what Dr. Nantambu said. In 1492, Europeans controlled only 9% of the world. Within 300 years afterwards, they had colonized 1/3 of the global humanity. By 1880, Europeans had ruled over 2/3 of the globe. And by 1935, they were in political control of not only 85% of the planet's resources, but also 70% of the world's populations. In 1990s, Europeans now control 85% of the world's population through its weapons of geopolitics or the New World Order, which is a very powerful statement. So I'll read that again. This is by Dr. Kwame Nantambu. He said, in 1492, Europeans controlled only 9% of the world. Within 300 years afterwards, they colonized 1/3 of the global humanity. By 1880, Europeans ruled over 2/3 of the globe. By 1935, they were in political control of not only 85% of the planet's resources, but also 70% of the world's population. In the 1990s, Europeans now control 85% of the world's population through its weapons of geopolitics or the New World Order. So, race, racism and white supremacy are ideologies which are now a byproduct of a xenophobic consciousness that has imposed upon the majority of inhabitants of the planet. Terms such as the white man's burden, manifest destiny, express the Europeans' belief in their God-given right to conquer the world and introduce civilization, in speech marks, to people of colour. According to this doctrine, the whiter your skin, the greater your intelligence, and the more privilege you are entitled to. To this end, racism and white supremacy are the power behind the most destructive forces the world has ever witnessed. Racism and white supremacy are synonymous and must never be confused with acts of prejudice. They are as different as night and day. So if I read that again, racism and white supremacy are synonymous and must never be confused with acts of prejudice. They are as different as night and day. All people have prejudices. This may be considered one of the humankind's great failings. However, for a group to legitimately classified as racist, it must possess the power to impose its prejudices on members of other ethnic groups. I don't know if I interject one moment. I don't know if you've read this story at a school in London, I believe, that a young girl who says that because within the school they don't take African history seriously and the 60 million people who died during slave days are not remembered. So she's saying that she doesn't remember Remembrance Day for like maybe the 6 million people or how many people died during the wars. But the school has labelled her racist because she doesn't want to remember the people who died in the First and Second World Wars. But to be racist, it shows that the school does not understand the concept of racist. Because to be racist, you must have, it's not about prejudice, it's about having the power to influence your presidents, yeah? You must be able to impose your prejudice beliefs. So, the system of racism and white supremacy was created to sustain the white minority's global dominance over the world and over the coloured majority populations. Racism and white supremacy ensures its control by influencing the thought and behaviour of those who benefit from perpetuation of this ideology, as well as its intended victims. Dr. Welsing has researched this subject extensively and has identified 9 areas of people activity that are controlled by racists and white supremacists that exert wide-ranging influence on society. And we need to understand or remember these 9 areas. So I hope you got a pen or you can make a note of this, okay? The 9 areas identified by Dr. Francis Cress Welsing are economics, education, entertainment, labour, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. So what she really said, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said was, racism, white supremacy works in 9 different areas. to ensure that its power stays. And these 9 areas are, or include, economics, education, entertainment, labour, law, politics, religion, sex and war. By understanding the origins and development of humanity, the evolution of mankind, and the conditions which led to the creation of the European, Africans can begin to see the world from a truly different perspective. By looking at the world events from this point of view, there can be no doubt that the presence of Africans in America and the current conditions of Africans in Africa are a direct result of survival strategies implemented by racist white supremacists over 500 years. The events of the past do not dissipate. They set in motion a chain of events that transcend time and space and shape the present. Consider this belief. My apologies. Consider this brief timeline of African and African relations as links in a chain that were forged in Europe and currently binds Africans in America. So I'm going to take a quick break now, people. Hope you're enjoying this. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. I am reading Survival Strategies by Anthony Browder, which I think, as you can see, is an excellent book. 13 Steps to Freedom is the subtitle of the book. So I'm going to take a short break. I must remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass Are Us, 7307 Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. Again, you can get Glass Are Us on 0208 800 6663. Please go to them for all your glazing needs. Glass repairs, double glazing repairs, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades on balconies. Any of your glazing needs, please go to Glass Are Us and mention the show. You'll get a 10% discount on your goods. So Glass Are Us, 7307 Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. Please go to Glass Are Us for all your glazing needs. And if you mention the show, you'll get a nice 10% discount. So I'll be taking a short break now. So I'll be back with you shortly.
Every man got the right to decide his own destiny. And in this judgment there is no partiality. So arm in arms with arms, we'll fight this little struggle, 'cause that's the only way we can overcome a little trouble. Brother, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're so right. We gon' fight, we'll have to fight, we gonna fight, fight for our rights. Not to trade it in a Zimbabwe, set it up in Zimbabwe, mash it up in a Zimbabwe. Africans are liberate. No more internal power struggle. We come together to overcome the little trouble. Soon we'll find out who is the real revolutionary. 'Cause I don't want my people to be it in Zimbabwe. Africans are liberate Zimbabwe. I liberate Zimbabwe. You're right, you're right, you're right, you're so right. We gon' fight, we gon' fight, we'll have to fight, we gon' fight, we gonna fight, we gon' fight, fighting for rights. To divide and rule could only tear us apart. In every man's chest there beats are. So soon we'll find out who is the real revolutionary. And I don't want my people to be tricked by mercenaries. Brother, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're so right. We'll have to fight, we gon' fight, we gonna fight, we gon' fight, we'll have to fight, we gon' fight, fighting for right. Trash it in a Zimbabwe, mash it up in a Zimbabwe, set it up in a Zimbabwe. Africans are liberate Zimbabwe, Africans are liberate Zimbabwe. Natty dub it in a Zimbabwe, set it up in a Zimbabwe. Africans are liberate Zimbabwe.
In times like these, war is not the answer, cause only love can conquer. Yeah, yeah. My resistance is getting weaker. I just can't stand the pressure. My mind is getting weaker. I've got to find some other pleasure. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Yeah. Oh, any other man. My mind in such a state. Thank God I've got some life left. I'm getting half a sudden, my soul stands at rest. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Misfortune is having me down. Sometimes it makes me sick. At times I try to hate, but I just don't know the trick. I need nothing to be a man, because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. To live just like any other man. Lord, I wanna live a good life. Love life like any other.
And the Afrocentricity Book Show is continuing. I hope you enjoyed those two tunes. The first one was by, as I'm sure you know, it was by Robert Nesta Marley, Zimbabwe. And the second one was Big Youth, for you guys of classic music who like those classics. And that was My Time. Again, this is the Afrocentricity Book Show every Sunday, 6 until 4 p.m. Please remember this show is sponsored by Glass R Us. and 7307 Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get them on 0208 800 6663, 0208 800 6663. You can go to Glass at Us for any of your glazing needs, repairs, double glazing, shelves, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrade, balconies, any of your glazing needs. Please go to Glass at Us at 7307 Sisters Road, and you can get them on 0208 800 6663. Please remember, if you mention the show, you will get a nice 10% discount. So I'm going to continue my reading of his book, which I hope you're enjoying. This is by the great author Anthony Browder. He comes over here many times and does many lectures. He's a very great scholar. I've met him in Egypt before, in the UK. He's really a great scholar. His books, you need to get all his books, yeah? So one of his other great books is the Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization, which is an immense book you really need to get, yeah? So again, I'm reading, this is really from the Browder File, Part 2, Survival Strategies, 13 Steps to Freedom. So I'm going to continue where I left off. Consider this brief timeline of European and African relations in links of a chain that was forged in Europe and currently binds Africans in America. So I've got some bullet points here. So in 1441, 12 kidnapped Africans were presented as a gift to Prince Henry of Portugal. In 1442, a year later, Pope Eugenius IV granted Europeans permission to enslave Africans, whom he regarded as soulless individuals. So please remember that, yeah, Catholics? In 1444, Europeans began importing Africans into Europe and the Americas. These actions over the next 400 years resulted in the death and enslavement of over 100 million men, women and children of African descent. And if I read that one again, in 1444, so this is really just 3 years after these first 12 kidnapped Africans were taken to Portugal, Europeans began importing Africans into Europe and the Americas. These actions were, over the next 400 years, resulted in the death and enslavement of over 100 million men, women and children of African descent. In 1665, the colony of Maryland, USA, enacted a legislation declaring that black people shall constitute an available, uncompensated, permanent, subordinated workforce, which shall be separated from the white society. In 1857, the Supreme Court, Dred Scott decision, declared that African Americans were not citizens of USA. In 1885, after 450 years of enslaving Africans, 14 European nations met in Berlin to decide how they would divide Africa amongst themselves and colonize the inhabitants. In 1896, 19 years after African Americans were granted citizenship, the United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson formally established the doctrine of separate but equal to justify the continued racial segregation. In 1964, Congress passed a civil rights bill officially banning discrimination in housing, education, employment. However, the Civil Rights Bill of 1990 was vetoed by President Bush because it feared it would introduce destructive force of quotas. Very interesting. So Africans were imported into Maryland probably in the early in the 17th century. And from that time until 1964, they had faced discrimination in every single level you could believe. And when, in 1964, Congress passed a Civil Rights Bill to try to undo this discrimination in housing, education, employment, and probably many other places as well, President Bush vetoed this. So, which tells you a lot about President Bush. In 1992, the Supreme Court set limits to the 1965 Voters' Rights Act and struck down a hate crime law that banned human burnings, that banned cross burnings. In 1995, the United States Congress passed legislation ensuring that African Americans would receive prison sentences for drug possession of crack cocaine at a ratio at 500 to 1 compared with the possession of powder cocaine used by Europeans. So as you can see, even the laws created in the USA are kind of race specific, if you believe in that face concept of race. But because crack cocaine, which was created by the government, not by the people themselves, were flooded certain neighborhoods, and they gave a difference of 500 to 1 in prison sentences to people who use crack cocaine to people who use powdered cocaine. Same drug, but obviously European Americans use the powder stuff much more than the crack cocaine because certain neighborhoods were flooded with crack cocaine. So 500 to 1. So that's why to this day you can see in the USA that black men and women are warehoused in prisons because these big industrial complexes are serious business. In 1996, an investigative reporter for the San Jose Mercury News alleged that the CIA played a major role in the introduction of powder and crack cocaine into the African American community in an effort to finance anti-communist forces in Nicaragua during the 1970s and 1980s. So because the CIA wanted to fund the anti-communist group in Nicaragua, they flooded neighborhoods mainly lived by African people with this drug to raise money. Can you believe that? The government flooded certain neighborhoods to make the people drug addicts. Singly, these events may be seen by some as isolated events that have no bearing on the present and do not constitute a specific pattern of behavior. However, when considered from an enlightened and well-informed perspective, it can be shown that the historical relationship between Africans and Europeans has been filled with strife and turmoil that will likely continue until power is more equally shared. If racism and white supremacy were not a persistent problem in America, Africans would not have been enslaved. There would have been no civil war. There would have been no need for affirmative action programs, nor would there now be a debate concerning the merits of continuing such programs. The presence of a racist and white supremacist consciousness in America led to the enactment of a constitutional amendments, the establishment of numerous civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, SNCC, SCLC, CORE, and the HBCUs, which are the historically black colleges and universities. Over the centuries, African Americans were told by their oppressors to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, even though many African Americans were bootless. Some who attempted to uplift themselves found the boot of their oppressors weighing heavily on their backs. Other Africans overcame oppressive forces, but never fully enjoyed the fruits of their labor because of their enactment of local, state, and federal legislation that prevented the accumulation of wealth and power. Numerous laws, also called black codes, were written to ensure that skilled African Americans could not secure licenses, open businesses, and compete fairly with Europeans. European Americans, businessmen. Many of these black codes were written when chattel slavery ended, and they remained in effect for almost 100 years. Despite these obstacles, U.S. history is replete with numerous examples of African American men and women who overcame tremendous odds to establish businesses, buy land, and develop their communities. Typically, however, whenever African Americans professionals were permitted or prohibited from joining European American business or professions associations, they had to form their own. For example, the African American physicians prohibited joining the American Medical Association, established the National Medical Association in 1895. The same is true of the African Americans who formed the National Dental Association in 1913 and the National Bar Association in 1925. The ever-prevailing presence of racism, white supremacy in America has continually forced African Americans to fend for themselves, sometimes with disastrous results. In the early 1900s, the African American business district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was deemed the most prosperous in all of America and was commonly referred to as Black Wall Street. The many banks, theaters, doctors' offices, and other African American owned businesses were a source of pride to African Americans in the community and throughout the nation. The economic stability of Black Wall Street was shattered in May 1921 during one of the worst pogroms in American history, when Tulsa became the first city ever to be bombed from the air. Irving Wallace described the wreckage of the black community in an article in March 13, 1993. So Irving Wallace said, "Whites invaded the black district, burning and looting and killing. To break up the riot, the police commandeered private planes and dropped dynamite. The police arrested more than 4,000 blacks and interned them in 3 camps. All blacks were forced to carry green ID cards, and when Tulsa was zoned for a new railway station, the blacks were routed through the black district, thus destroying it." I repeat, Irving Wallace said, whites, this is about article in March 13, 1993, whites invaded the black district, burning, looting and killing. To break up the riot, the police commandeered private planes and dropped dynamite onto men, women and children. The police arrested more than 4,000 blacks and interned them in 3 camps. All blacks were forced to carry green ID cards. And when Tulsa was zoned for a new railroad station, the tracks were routed right through the business district, thus destroying it. And so I've heard this happen many times. I've read that when you get a very successful area, they'll put up a railroad or a freeway for it, thus destroying the area. This is consistent behavior. This is not like a one-off or some sort of random behavior. There are numerous articles and publications that discuss this sad chapter in American history, and they are well worth reading. The Gap Band, I'm sure you know the doom, 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 doom. Yeah, the R&B musical group that hails from Tulsa has kept the memory of this tragic event alive. So the Gap Band, some of you know, some of you may not know, GAP stands for the initials of Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, that were major streets in the heart of the black community there. So when you hear the Gap Band, yeah, GAP stands to let you know that GAP was the era that these Ku Klux Klan type people bombed from the air and destroyed this thriving community. One way to describe this would be like Beverly Hills. It's like a small kind of Beverly Hills, extremely rich. But there we go. Bomb from the air. So they speak about 9/11, which of course they should, but they never speak about when they bombed their own country themselves. It's amazing. A similar incident occurred in Rosewood, Florida, in January 1923, and there's a film called Rosewood. The black town of Rosewood was completely destroyed by a mob of riotous whites after a white woman claimed to have been assaulted by a black man. The motion picture Rosewood, which was directed by John Singleton in 1996, documents a tragic episode of African American history. There is no aspect of life in America immune from the ravages of racism. The spectre of white supremacy has been reared its ugly head within the American church, as ministers proclaim that all humans were children of God from the pulpits. Racism prevented blacks and whites from sitting together in the pews. This hypocrisy compelled Richard Allen to establish America's first African-American denomination in 1794. True to his cultural leanings, Allen called the institution the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is often stated that the most racially segregated hour in the United States occurs between 11 a.m. and noon on Sunday mornings. European Americans go to white churches and pray to a white God. African American churches traditionally go to a black church and pray to a white God. Within the last decade, however, there have been growing movement among African American Christians to acknowledge the African origins of Jesus Christ, but I have yet to see any European Americans embrace this view. These issues will be discussed at greater detail in Step 10. In 1992, Pope John Paul II asked God to forgive Christians for their involvement in the shameful commerce of the Europeans enslaving our Africans. In 1995, during their annual meeting, the Southern Baptist Convention asked God to forgive the racism they condoned throughout the 150 years of existence. Let us not forget that the burning cross of the Ku Klux Klan represents their fervent desire to uphold white Christian traditions. During the period of African American enslavement in the South, white ministers frequently used biblical scriptures to justify slavery. As recently as May the 9th, 1976, Alabama State Senator Charles Davidson, a Republican congressional candidate, used biblical scriptures to defend the enslavement of Africans. Although Davidson was later admonished for his views, the relationship between religion and racism has been examined by numerous individuals and organizations. Supposed safe havens for worship of God, black churches were often targets for bombings by white supremacists in the 1960s. African American sanctuaries were not deemed sacred in the past, and its sanctity continues to be disrespected today. During recent decades, there have been numerous acts of vandalism committed against African American churches. These attacks have increased dramatically during the 1990s. On May 22nd, in 1996, the Washington Post reported on a House Judiciary Committee hearing on church arson. And this is what it said. According to the Justice Department figures, there have now been 28 arson attacks on African American churches, mainly in the South. In the past 17 months, civil rights groups say as many as 45 black churches have been attacked since 1990. So that's kind of strange, don't you think? Because obviously the USA is supposed to be a Christian nation. How can they burn, attack, vandalize Christian churches in a Christian nation? you normally see on the news they're talking about what Islam does and how Christians are treated by Islam. I think presently there's that girl in India, and she said something against the Prophet, I believe, and she was locked up in prison. So the news will keep talking about how terrible it was, and it's terrible to oppress anybody over religion. I do agree. However, 45 churches have been bombed. Don't you remember that guy Ruth, just a few years back, went into a church, slaughtered the people inside the church, Christian church. But what's done about it? How can it happen in a Christian church? How can you be a Christian nation and not defend the churches? At a congressional hearing, Deval L. Patrick, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, testified, "The numbers are chilling. We are facing an epidemic of terror." However, federal law enforcement officials stated that they had found no evidence of a widespread conspiracy. Some individuals appear related, and others have been traced to members of white supremacist groups. Although several fires were ruled accidental, Judiciary Committee members saw nothing unusual in the fact that an unusually high number of African American churches have been subjected to arson and vandalism. Despite a plethora of horrific attacks, neither the government nor the media has referred to these incidents as terrorist attacks. It is a sad commentary on the state of this nation when one realizes that there is no aspect of life in America exempt from the horrors of white supremacy racism. The racist social structure was designed to render African Americans mentally, physically, and spiritually subservient to the will of their perceived masters. History teaches that racist organizations and institutions will never change their ideologies until they are forced to do so by the determined will of those who have been oppressed. In the past, whenever changes have been made, they were usually temporary modifications to political, economic, and religious gains that benefited the majority populations. People of African descent must ever be mindful of Francis Cress Wells's assertions that the driving force behind race and white supremacy is white genetic survival. People of European ancestry have historically enacted laws forbidding racial mixing because of a basic fear of genetic annihilation. Scientists have proven that Europeans are genetically recessive, and politicians have enacted legislation to ensure that a child born of a union between a European and a genetically dominant African will never be classified as white. This reality has been the driving force behind the laws that uphold apartheid, segregation, and Jim Crow. Such laws reveals European commitment to ensure genetic survival in a world dominated by people of color. Racism and white supremacy is an unfortunate reality of life, but its presence should not be used as an excuse for failure. Racism and white supremacy can only be overcome by acknowledging their existence, understanding their operational mode, and formulating plans of action to neutralize their objectives. Racism works only if you buy into the concept of race and believe in the superficial hierarchical ranking of human beings. White supremacy exists because people of color have been taught to believe in the supremacy of white people, and have allowed them, to define reality, i.e. define what is real in the world. Racism and white supremacy is a false system that derives its power from the unquestioned support given by people of color. Currently, there are numerous propagandists who would have you believe that racism is dead and that America has become a colorblind society. Both statements are completely false. Racism will end only when sexism, greed, and hatred ends, and not 1 second before. Those who claim not to see color are trivializing the ethnic differences that make people unique. Ignoring a person's skin color is a poor excuse for not cultivating humane behavior that allows you to see all people as humans and appreciate the divinity that exists within everyone. It is time for people of African descent to begin empowering ourselves through a change of our consciousness and corresponding changes in our behavior. When these changes are made, they will lead to an increased awareness of the power that exists within the individual and the collective group. We have been separated from our sources of power through the use of fear, anger, and miseducation. By using our time judiciously, we can overcome fear, abolish the anger, and empower ourselves with new systems of knowledge and governance. By concluding this first step, it is helpful for you to do a self-analysis of how racism and white supremacy have affected your life. Please set aside some time on a daily or weekly basis to conduct these 3 exercises listed below and record your answers so that you may evaluate and update them over an extended period of time. Do not feel pressured to answer all of the questions in one sitting, and above all, be completely honest with yourself when you do answer the questions. So let me say, in concluding this first step, it is helpful for you to do a self-analysis of how racism and white supremacy has affected your life. Please set aside time in a daily or weekly basis to conduct the 3 exercises listed below and record your answers so that you may evaluate and update them over an extended period of time. These 3 exercises listed below, and what you must do is record your answers. So do not feel pressured to answer all the questions in one sitting. Above all, be completely honest with yourself when you do answer the questions. So these 3 exercises here. So we go through these exercises very slowly and see what you think. So what Tony Brody is saying, that you need to get a piece of paper and you need to carry out a self-analysis of yourself, of your life, of your beliefs, yeah, your behaviors, of your experiences. So let me drop these 3 questions now, yeah? So question number 1, or this is an exercise, yeah? Question number 1, when did you first become aware of racism and how did that initial awareness affect you? So that will make you think, yeah? You really have to think back, yeah? Question number 1, when did you first become aware of racism and how did that initial awareness affect you? Question number 2, examine the 9 areas of human activity and list those areas where you have been directly affected by racism, white supremacy. So if I go back and find those areas, one moment. Remember these okay. So the 9 areas are economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. So what the question that Tony Broder dropped on us was, how have those 9 areas affected you? Or how have those, let me read here, the 9 areas of human activity. List those areas where you have been directly affected by racism, white supremacy. So those 9 areas again are economics, education, entertainment, labor, i.e. employment, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. Have you been affected by white supremacy in those areas or racism in those areas? And finally, question number 3. Interview the elder members of your family and discuss the impact that racism and white supremacy have had on their lives. Compare your findings and evaluate the extent to which racist attitudes have changed. That's quite deep. Okay. So what you need to do is question the oldest people in your family, or maybe just the elders, because some of your elders might not be here, might have left the country. Question the eldest people you can see of your family, your community, and ask them, discuss the impact that racism has had on their lives. Compare your findings and evaluate the extent to which racism attitudes have changed. So I think what he's saying is, speak to elders and find out how their life has been impacted, and then compare that with how your life has been impacted. And maybe you can analyse this too, to see how attitudes have changed over a period of time, which is quite deep. What I would say is, when you do speak with elders, have children there, have your youngsters there, so they can understand. Because sometimes we've got these intergenerational kind of barriers between us, and we don't really link our grandparents, our parents, our children with us, and we speak to find out what is. When I speak, or when I've spoken, or when I do speak with elders, that's when you really learn things, because you don't understand the world unless you speak to find out. Because sometimes, as a young person, there's a lot of experiences you're not going to experience, but what you need to do, how you can experience or understand them, is either by reading books, which this book club is about, but also by speaking to the elders, because they'll tell you what it's like when they was a child, teenager, growing up as adults, yeah? So it's very important. So it's very important that our children, any age of our children, yeah, from the young coming up, speak to their elders and find out what the world was like. And it's good to speak to them, because, just children speak to elders, they can speak about their experiences, they can speak about the songs they sung, poems they read, stories they read, what things were like. So it's very important they understand, because we do see some of our youngsters have complete disconnect with their elders, disconnect with, the world as it was, because of, we spoke about earlier, really, what this book is about, the kind of disconnection or the miseducation we've had. So it's very important. So this chapter ends after those 3 questions. As you record and evaluate your responses, you will become more aware of the presence of racism, white supremacy in your life. As your awareness increases, you must not allow yourself to become overwhelmed or intimidated by your findings. This knowledge will help you deal more effectively with the obstacles in your path. Awareness of a problem is often the first steps towards developing the ability to overcome it. So if I repeat that, after the 3 questions, as you record and evaluate your responses, you will become more aware of the presence of racism, white supremacy in your life. As your awareness increases, you must not allow yourself to become overwhelmed or intimidated by your findings. This knowledge will help you deal more effectively with the obstacles in your path. Awareness of a problem is often the first steps towards developing the ability to overcome it. And if I read those 3 questions again, so you can do these 3 as an exercise. When did you first become aware of racism, and how did that initial awareness affect you? Number 2, examine the 9 areas of human activity and list those areas where you have been directly affected by racism, white supremacy. And remember those 4 areas are, or there's 9 areas are, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex and war. And the third question was, interview the elder members of your family, or elders generally, and discuss the impact that racism and white supremacy has had on their lives. Compare your findings and evaluate the extent to which racist attitudes have changed. So this is not about getting angry, because anger doesn't get you anywhere. Yes, a realization. Sometimes you get angry, then you have to sit down and say, well, anger's not going to get me anywhere. But it's about understanding. It's only when you understand these things that you're able to counter them. Because if you don't know what's happening, don't know how you're affected by it, you can't do anything wrong, yeah? So if you need medicine, a doctor will find out what the symptoms are, and he'll try and give you a cure. He'll give you a medicine, tablets, exercise, where it could be, as a cure to whatever ails you. That's the only way. So you need to do an analysis, like a doctor does, to find out what are the symptoms of this illness that we are inflicted with. And once we know that, then we are able to count it, or counter it, I should say. If you are familiar with Frantz Fanon, he was a really, truly great psychologist. He said that, because he wrote a few great books. He wrote Black Skin, White Mask, and he wrote the other titles will come to me. And he said that he came across a lot of people who were inflicted by racism, white supremacy. Maybe he didn't use those terms, but it was about the racism. And he said it's no good him like bandaging them up and sending them back out there again, because they're just going to get sick again, because the symptoms, the powers or the behaviours of others, which, or you could say the institutions which impose that illness onto people, is still intact. What he said, the only way to fix it is to destroy that which is making you sick. So being a Fanonite, and I'm a Fanonite myself, you have to destroy those things which is oppressing our family. That's the only way. Otherwise, your children, your great-children, great-great-great-grandchildren will be in the same boat. So if you see something out there which is harming you, the only way to get by it or to stop it from harming you or your family is to destroy those things. And that is by the words of Frantz Fanon. So I hope you enjoyed this book here. This is the end of the first chapter of Survival Strategies by Dr. Tony Browder, 13 Steps to Freedom. Yeah, Dr. Tony Browder. It's survival strategies in 13 steps. So numbers of 1 to 13. So we just read step 1, and it's really all about, you split the book into 3 areas. Part 1 is about the mind. So what we just read was step 1, which is racism, white supremacy are the most persistent problems confronting Africans in America and, by extension, the world. Step 2, or my apologies, yet step 2, which we will read next week, is become aware of the power of the media. Step 3 is perception precedes being. You are who you believe you are. And step 4, information is power. But power is nothing without control. And step 5, empower your mind, see the world through your African eyes. So that is part 1, all about the mind. And we'll continue with this next week through step 2, which is becoming aware of the power of the media. So the power of the media, as you know, the media is controlled by people who really have a poor opinion of African people. So sadly, the media affects people's minds, controls people's minds, control their thoughts. As I said before, really people are really sheeple. People don't really question things. They read newspapers, they watch the TV, listen to the news, and they don't question things. They just accept what they're told because they believe it must be the truth. Why are people going to tell lies? But when we begin to look at the world through our own eyes, we'll see that, unfortunately, the world is just not a simple place where you must accept what you are told or what you see or what you read. As African people, we have been lied to more than anybody else on this planet, and it continues up to this day. As Tony Browler said in the beginning of this book, when he went to Egypt, I think in the 80s, he said, and when he found out the history, they found out some truth about history, he said he couldn't believe that he'd been miseducated so much. He didn't have a clue about who he was. I was in a group, a WhatsApp group, with a lot of Zimbabweans. And obviously they was educated by the people who left Britain, educated these people over many decades and decades and decades, over a century, yes? They didn't know who they were. They didn't have a clue about the Nile Valley. They didn't have a clue about Africa. Their view of African is like grass skirts, walking naked, spears. And this is Zimbabweans. Many of them, obviously some did, many did know, but I think the majority did not know and still don't know who they are. Because, as you know, they were educated so they can feel inferior to those who say they are superior. And this is where you control people. It's not really a new philosophy. This is probably as old as the planet, that people will impose themselves and impose or condition others to have an inferior position. Because if you believe you are superior, you will act that way. And if you feel you are inferior, you will act that way. In the book, The Miseducation of the Negro, which I'm sure many of you know, he says in that book, he says that if a person feels inferior, you won't even have to ask him to go around to the back door, to knock on the back door, because he knows he's inferior, he should go for the front door. And he goes on to say, and if there's not a back door, he will make one himself, which is pretty deep, as I think I've been to realize, yeah? So your mind, doesn't matter how big and powerful you are, if your mind is controlled, you are controlled. And that is why people do condition the mind. So as African people, we have been conditioned to our inferiority. And when you look across the black world, wherever we are, and sadly you'll find that we are not in position of strength right across this world. The USA, there are some seriously rich and powerful people there. Unfortunately, when you look at the massive Africans in the USA, they are not in a strong position. Why? Because the federal government, local government, is still controlled by these people with that same sort of mentality of white superiority and black inferiority. Because they kind of go in hand, because, yeah, one doesn't make sense without the other. You cannot have white supremacy unless you've got black inferiority, just like you can't have up without down, you can't have left without right, you can't have night without day. One doesn't make sense without the other. So, Afrocentricity, because this book I'm reading there is from one of our great Afrocentric scholars. Afrocentricity is about us seeing the world through our own eyes. It's about us understanding where our center is. Our center is we are African people, we come from Africa, and all African people are the same people. And then once you understand and you become grounded in what your center is, then everything you do, everything you say, everything you think about, everything that comes in contact with you, you must view from your own perspective, from your own values. If you are involved in something, how does it benefit you? How does it benefit your family? How does it benefit your people? Or alternatively, how does it negatively affect your people? African centre thought is that you see everything through perspective of Africa. So we have been portrayed of, like if you think of like the world as a stage, the way we've portrayed that we are not actors on the stage. We're the props. We are the tables and chairs that other people can move around the stage. Because we've got no agency. As in, agency, what does that mean? Agency means really we are not able to do anything for ourselves. We're told to do things. We're moved by other people. So it's like our history. We'll have like the Windrush, i.e. the ship, or all these other ships, you know, what they have got about us in our history. So again, we didn't do nothing. We sat there in darkness waiting for people to come. But when you understand the truth and see the world through your own eyes, you can understand that the complete opposite is the truth. You'll see that African people created the first laws, the first notion of a religion, the first scientists, doctors, libraries, architecture. All these things were created by Africans, and you can still see if you go to Africa today. Everybody needs to go to the Nile Valley today and start from the Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia. You need to go to these countries to see what is actually there. Many people do tours to these countries. This is the only way you're going to understand what the world is about. We cannot rely on the TV, because unfortunately the TV is a television as opposed to television, because it's pure lie. I saw a program very recently about the first civilizations in Central America, in Mexico, and they've got there something called the Olmec heads, OLMECS heads, and these are heads, gigantic heads, 5-6 foot tall. These heads are carved out of stone of black people. But when the person's speaking about it, you look at these faces and he doesn't say a word. Like people from Mexico, excuse me, don't look like these big carved heads, but he doesn't say words. Oh, these are the Olmecs, and then he just moves on very quickly. And when you look at these, faces, it's clear that these things are seriously African civilizations. And they don't speak about it, really, particularly USA, because if they did that, they'll have to admit that Africans brought writing and calendars and architecture and building in stone to the USA, in the Americas, for the first time, before Europeans got there. And I'm sure you're aware of also that Columbus said to his sons, when he was on his way to the Americas, he saw black people, African people, on the way, going the opposite way, going back to Africa. So Columbus himself said that he saw African people. And when they got there, they they saw quite black people all over the place in the Americas. This is Columbus and his Spanish and other Portuguese people, and they said they saw African people all over South America, if you read these things as well. And also what Columbus did as well, he found a spear tips, what they call guanim, and it's 1 part silver, 1 part gold, 1 part steel or iron. I can't remember the third part. So he took it back to the SA office in Portugal so they could examine it, and they found out the ratio of the metal. What they found in the Americas was the exact same ratio of metal used in West Africa, to show that obviously West African people were trading in the Americas all this time before. So this is history. History will set you free, people, yeah? The truth will set you free. Power comes from knowledge, but it's got to be organized knowledge, because some people have got knowledge, they live in poverty, they don't know what to do. We need to have organized knowledge. Organized knowledge is what is really power. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's show. We was reading Survival Strategies, 13 Steps to Freedom by Anthony Browder. We'll continue on the same line next week. This has been Afrocentricity Book Show. Please tell your friends about it. It's a great show. It helps us to see the world through our own eyes. I'll catch you next week. Have a great week. Yeah. Don't forget, every Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m. I'll see you then. You have a great week.
Mama Africa, Mama Africa, am I coming home? Am I coming home? Hello, Mama Africa, how are you? I'm feeling fine, and I hope you're fine too. Hello, Mama Africa, how are you? I hope when you hear these words, your grace turn blue, grace turn blue.
You gonna cue me, or are you gonna tell me when just the vibe going on? Or you just gonna set it up? right. What you feeling down for? No, I like that. I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up. Listen, Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Father God, in your